I was 34 the year I stayed at the cabin. It was the spring of 2019, late April, just when the days start getting longer but the nights still hold on to that last bit of winter. I'd just gone through a breakup that dragged on for months. My ex and I had shared an apartment in Tacoma, Washington. After she moved out, the place felt empty and loud in weird ways. Like the echo of everything we were supposed to be still bounced off the walls. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. I needed a break from everything. So I took some time off, just a week, and booked this old cabin in a part of northern Idaho I'd never been to before, near a lake called Flat Rock, a couple miles from a town named Dunsmuir. Never heard of it, which made it perfect. The cabin was owned by some guy who listed it online as a solitude escape for hunters, writers, and those who need silence. That's what drew me to it, the promise of silence. The pictures showed an old wooden place tucked back into the pines, with a porch and a small dock down a short slope. No other houses in view, just the trees, the water, and this single road winding through the woods to the property. I got there on a Monday afternoon after a 6-hour drive. The last half hour was all narrow gravel roads, dust kicking up behind my car and pine branches scraping against the side mirrors. It was beautiful in the way wild places are, uncontrolled and indifferent to your presence. The kind of place where you could vanish and no one would know for a while. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood siding, dark green trim around the windows, and a crooked little porch with 2 rusted chairs and a cooler that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked beside the tree line and just stood there for a while, listening. It was quiet in a way you only find far from people. No hum of traffic, no planes overhead, just the wind and birds and the creak of trees leaning into each other. The inside of the cabin was basic. One main room with a bed, a table, a small couch, and a wood-burning stove. There was a tiny kitchen along the back wall and a narrow door leading to a bathroom that smelled like pine cleaner and old pipes. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell service either. The owner had left a laminated sheet explaining how to use the generator out back if the solar battery ever ran low. I flipped a few switches, turned on the water pump, and started unpacking. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read, wrote in a notebook, went down to the lake to skip rocks or just sit on the dock with my feet dangling above the water. I cooked simple meals, made coffee in the mornings, and listened to the sounds around the cabin. Birds, squirrels, the crack of branches now and then. There were some deer that came through the clearing one evening. I watched them from the window and felt more settled than I had in months. It was on the 3rd night that something changed. It started with the sounds. I woke up just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was steady. A soft crunching of leaves and twigs, slow and deliberate, like someone walking around the cabin. I lay still in the dark, heart beating a little faster. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but I didn't hear sniffing or snorting, just careful footsteps circling the building. I got out of bed slowly, not turning on any lights. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. It was dark out. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees were thick around the property. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound kept going. Crunch, pause, crunch. It circled around to the back of the cabin and stopped near the kitchen. There was a long silence then. No movement, no wind. I stood there, frozen, listening so hard my ears rang. Then something brushed against the back wall of the cabin, something heavy enough to make the wood creak. I stepped back from the window and grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table earlier. I waited 5-10 minutes. No more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I looked for tracks but didn't see anything clear. The ground was mostly pine needles and moss, hard to read. No trash disturbed, no marks on the windows or doors. I kept telling myself it was an animal, maybe even my imagination. Stress and isolation can mess with you, but that night it happened again. This time I stayed up, waiting. I left the lights off, flashlight in hand, sitting on the couch with a blanket around me. Around 12:30, the sound started again. The same slow footsteps, same pattern. This time they didn't stop at the back. They came up onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under the weight. I could hear the long groan of old nails shifting. I didn't move. I just stared at the door, heart hammering. I was sure someone was out there. Person. I could feel it. Then something tapped the door. Not hard, just one slow tap. And then nothing. I waited almost an hour before moving. I didn't go to the door. I didn't open it. I just sat there, every muscle tense, every sound amplified. I slept for maybe 2 hours after sunrise, then packed up half my stuff and threw it in the car. I almost left. I wanted to, but something about it didn't make sense. If someone was messing with me, why? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't posted about it. The place was remote. You'd have to know it was there to even find it. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. I walked the perimeter again. This time I found something. Behind the cabin, in the space between 2 trees, I saw what looked like a broken branch at first. But it wasn't broken. It had been cut, clean, about waist height, and below it, in the dirt, a shoe print. Not an animal. A boot. Large, maybe size 11 or 12. Deep enough to be fresh. I followed the direction it pointed for a few yards, but it disappeared into the underbrush. I went back inside and locked everything up. I moved the couch in front of the door and kept the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen beside the bed that night. I didn't sleep. The third night was worse. It started later, closer to 2 a.m., same pattern. Footsteps, movement around the cabin. This time, the back door handle jiggled. Just once. Then the window on the left side of the cabin, closest to the bed, tapped once, twice. Then silence. I stayed in bed, eyes wide open, knife clutched in my hand. I didn't move until daylight. As soon as the sun was up, I walked to the road where the car was parked and started it. I was going to leave. I had to. But when I got to the driver's side, I saw the tires. All 4 of them were flat, slashed, clean cuts, same angle on each one. Someone had done it with a blade. I stood there for a while, looking up the road, into the trees and back toward the cabin. I wasn't just being messed with. Someone didn't want me to leave. I checked the car again. The engine started fine. Nothing under the hood was messed with. But without tires, I wasn't going anywhere. The nearest town was 14 miles away. The road wasn't one I wanted to walk alone. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin. I didn't eat. I barely drank anything. I kept watch from the window, scanning the woods for movement. I thought about trying to climb a tree and wait until night passed. I thought about running and not stopping. But fear kept me there. The kind that paralyzes, that wraps around your spine and tightens. That night, I turned off all the lights, unplugged everything that made noise, and sat with my back against the wall. Knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I waited. The footsteps came earlier this time, just past 11. They came fast, no slow circling. Whoever it was moved straight to the front porch. I heard the boards creak again, heard something heavy drop, like a backpack or sack. Then the door shook. Not just a tap. Someone yanked on the handle hard. Then again. The couch shuddered in place. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. The window shattered. Came from the back of the cabin. The sound was sharp and clean. I turned and saw the glass glinting on the floor, the cold air rushing in. I ran. Out the front, past the porch, down the slope toward the lake. I didn't look back. I just ran until my legs gave out. I ended up under the dock, curled in the mud, knife still in my hand. I stayed there all night. I didn't sleep. I watched the trees, the path, the cabin lit faintly by moonlight. I didn't see anyone come out. When the sun rose, I crept back to the cabin. The front door was wide open. Inside, everything was torn up. Not destroyed, searched. The drawers were pulled out. My bags dumped. The bed flipped. Whoever it was, they were looking for something. But they hadn't taken anything. Not the little cash I had. Not my watch. Not the laptop. Just looked and left. I walked out to the car. Still flat. I grabbed my pack and started walking. I made it to the highway by sunset, waving down a truck driver who radioed for help. The The local police came. I rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota in September 2018. I was 31 at the time and had just gone through a long stretch of work without a break. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I felt this tightness in my head that wouldn't go away. Like my brain couldn't slow down. I didn't want to go somewhere with people or distractions, so I found this listing online for a remote off-grid cabin next to a lake. No phone service, no internet, just a generator and a wood stove. It seemed perfect. The owner gave me directions through email, no address, just a hand-drawn map and written instructions. It was about 2 hours from the nearest town. I packed a cooler with enough food for a week, filled the truck with gas, and drove up alone. The last hour of the drive was on gravel roads, winding through thick forest. I didn't pass a single car after leaving the highway. The cabin sat near a small lake called Pine Glass Lake. It was tucked back about 100 yards from the water, surrounded by trees, mostly birch and pine. It was a simple structure, made of weathered cedar with a green metal roof. There was a fire pit out front, a stack of firewood under a tarp, and a narrow path that led to a rickety dock on the water. No neighbors in sight, no boat sounds, just wind and birds. Inside, it was one room, a wood stove in one corner, a twin bed against the back wall, a small table and 2 chairs by the only window, and a propane stove for cooking. There was a composting toilet in a shed about 20 feet behind the cabin. The place was basic, but it was clean. No electricity unless I ran the generator, which I planned to use only for short periods at night. I brought books, a journal, and a small solar-powered radio for news and weather. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and a hatchet. The first 2 days were peaceful. I fished from the dock, wrote in my journal, cooked simple meals, and listened to loons in the distance. The nights were darker than I was used to, but I liked that. I'd sit outside in the cold, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars and listening to the wind move through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. On the 3rd day, I woke up around 5:30 a.m. to a strange feeling. Not a sound exactly, but the sense that something had changed. The air felt heavier, stiller. When I stepped outside, there was a faint smell in the air. Something musky. Not smoke, but something off. I looked around and didn't see anything unusual. The woods looked the same. I checked the generator off, checked the door locked. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place and tried to shake it. That afternoon, I took the trail that looped around the lake. It wasn't marked well, just a narrow dirt path worn into the ground. I walked for maybe 3 hours, moving slow, taking in the trees and the smell of pine needles. About halfway around, I saw an old deer stand, rusted and half collapsed, nailed into a tree. It looked abandoned for years. A little further, I found a pile of animal bones. Not fresh, but not completely bleached either. Scattered, like something had dragged them there. Could have been coyotes or even a bear. Still, it made me uneasy. Back at the cabin that evening, I was cleaning a pan outside when I noticed a set of boot prints in the dirt near the corner of the cabin. Not mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots with a distinct tread. These were narrower, smaller, and had a different pattern. It had rained the night before, so the prints were fresh. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out how someone could have gotten here. I hadn't heard a vehicle. No neighbors nearby. The trail to the cabin was overgrown and hard to spot even in daylight. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and found nothing else. No trash, no signs of a camp. Just those footprints near the corner. I covered them with a piece of plywood from under the cabin and brought the axe inside with me that night. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made me flinch. I kept thinking about those prints. Who had been out here? A hiker? A hunter? Someone passing through? But there wasn't a marked trail close by. I kept going over the map in my head. It didn't add up. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a noise outside. A soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. Then another, closer. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat there in the dark, trying to listen. The sound didn't repeat. No breathing, no footsteps. Just silence again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked for tracks, but the ground was dry and covered in leaves. If there had been someone, they hadn't left any new signs. I kept telling myself maybe it was a deer or a raccoon, but I knew the sound of a large footstep. It wasn't small. I didn't go far that day. I stayed near the cabin, kept my knife on me, and checked the treeline every few minutes. I started noticing how exposed the cabin was. Windows facing the woods, only one door, no lock strong enough to keep someone determined out. I realized I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was, just the general area. No one would know if something happened. That night, I ran the generator for 15 minutes to charge my flashlight batteries. I didn't use the light much, though. I sat inside with the stove burning, staring at the walls. Around 11 p.m., I heard something again. This time a thud came from behind the cabin. Not a knock, not a branch falling. A flat, dull thud, like someone leaning or bumping against the wood. I froze. Then I grabbed the flashlight and stood by the window, not shining it out yet. I waited for movement. 30 seconds passed. Then I slowly cracked the door and shone the beam behind the cabin. Nothing. I stepped out, heart racing, light scanning the trees. I walked around the back. No one, but something had been there. There was a long scuff mark on the lower part of the wall. Not a boot print. More like someone had leaned hard against it and slid slightly. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed my cooler, strapped it shut, and put it in the truck. I didn't leave yet. I told myself I had 2 more nights, and I wasn't going to cut the trip short just because I felt scared. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just fear, it was dread. Like I was being watched. Not every second, but off and on. Like whoever it was had a rhythm, checking in from the woods, waiting. Around noon, I heard a vehicle engine. Faint but there. I walked up the trail to the main road and waited. A dusty white pickup passed slowly. No plates on the front. Driver wore a hat, sunglasses. He didn't wave, just stared ahead and kept driving. I turned and walked back, faster than I meant to. I couldn't shake the idea that it was connected, that whoever had been outside the cabin had come back to look again. That night, I didn't light the stove. I kept the cabin dark and quiet. I sat on the bed with the axe across my lap, facing the door. The window had no curtains, so I moved the table in front of it and leaned the mattress upright as a barrier. I stayed like that for hours. At 2:17 a.m., I heard slow footsteps on the leaves outside. Not an animal. Measured human steps. I held my breath. The steps circled the cabin, deliberate and unhurried. Then they stopped. I waited. The night pressed in so heavy I thought my chest would crack. Then the doorknob jiggled. Just once. I gripped the axe and stood up. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't speak, didn't try again. Just silence. I stayed standing for another hour, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. At sunrise, I left. I didn't make coffee, didn't even brush my teeth. I got in the truck, turned it around fast, and drove hard down that gravel road. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole time, expecting to see that white truck, but I never did. I reported it to the local sheriff's office when I got back to town. They took a report but didn't seem too interested. Said maybe it was a poacher or some squatter passing through. They didn't send anyone out. Said it was too remote. A week later, I checked the listing online again. Curious. It was gone. No trace. The owner never responded to my follow-up emails. I still think about that trip. Not every day, but enough. The way it felt, the shift in the air, the scuffed wall, the slow footsteps, the hand on the doorknob. There was no ghost, no monster, just a person out there in the dark, watching, waiting, and they knew I was alone. I haven't been back to the woods since. I was 32 when I decided to take a week off and stay alone in a cabin I found online. It was September of 2022, and I had been working nonstop for months at a manufacturing plant outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The long shifts, night work, and rotating schedules were draining everything out of me. I needed something quieter, far away from any buzz of machines, alarms, or foot traffic. Just space, air, trees, and no one else. The place I booked was about 4 hours north, near a small town called Ridge Hollow. It wasn't the kind of spot people drove through unless they were headed somewhere deeper into the state forests. The cabin was listed by an older man named Craig who ran a few rentals out that way. It sat on 20 acres of wooded land, backed by a shallow creek and surrounded by uneven, rocky forest terrain. There was no cell reception, but there was a landline for emergencies. The place ran off propane and solar power, and there was a backup generator in a shed out back. I liked that. It meant I could still have light, a stove, and hot water, but no distractions. I packed food, clothes, some tools, 2 knives, my .22 rifle, and a bunch of firewood since the nights were starting to get cold. I didn't plan on hiking much. I just wanted to read, write, sit on the porch, and maybe fish at the creek if I felt like it. I got to the cabin just after noon on a Monday. The sky was clear, blue with high white clouds, and the trees were just starting to shift color. Deep green giving way to yellow and a few touches of red. The cabin looked older in person than it did in the photos. The porch sagged a little on one side, and the roof shingles were curled at the edges, but it was sturdy. It smelled like pine, dried smoke, and age. There was a dusty wood stove inside, a worn couch, and a narrow kitchen with a small gas fridge and stove. The bedroom had one window that overlooked the trees, and the bathroom was tiny, but it had hot water and pressure. I liked it right away. That first day, I just unpacked and sat out on the porch for hours, listening to the wind move through the trees. There were birds calling, distant rustling sounds, and the occasional thump of something falling deeper in the forest. Maybe a branch or a squirrel knocking something loose. Nothing unusual. I had dinner just before sunset. Some canned stew heated on the stove, then read until dark and went to bed. It was quiet that night. So quiet I woke up a few times because of how silent everything was. No cars, no buzz from power lines, not even wind. Just the sound of my own breathing. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. The next morning I walked down to the creek. It was maybe a 10-minute walk behind the cabin, downhill a little, and covered with thick brush. The creek was wider than I expected, about 15 feet across in most places, and only a few feet deep. The water was clear and slow. I saw trout moving under the rocks, fast little flashes of silver that vanished the moment I stepped closer. There was a log across one bend that looked like it had been there for years, gray and water-worn. I sat there for a while just watching. There were no trails, no footprints, no trash. Nothing that said anyone had been through here in a long time. I liked that. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I chopped some kindling, checked the backup generator just to be sure it worked. It started on the second pull, then spent the evening reading again. I lit the wood stove after the sun dipped behind the ridge. The cabin held heat better than I expected. The air inside got thick and comfortable, and I drifted off on the couch for a little before going to bed properly. Sometime during the night, I heard something outside. A short, heavy thud. Not close, but clear. I woke up, lay still, and listened. Nothing followed it. Just stillness again. I didn't feel nervous, just alert. Could have been a deer, maybe a fallen branch. But when you're not used to being that far from people, every sound hits different. I waited, listened, then went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin just to look. I didn't find anything out of place. No tracks, no disturbed brush, nothing odd. I went back down to the creek again after breakfast. I brought my rod and tried fishing, but didn't catch anything. I saw something across the water, though, about 30 yards off beyond the trees. A dark shape, big enough to be a person, but it was far and partially blocked by trunks. It wasn't moving. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. Probably a tree or a stump. But it made me uneasy. That night, I lit the fire again and read longer. I kept hearing things. Not big sounds, just slight ones, like snapping twigs, a faint scuffle on the porch, maybe even a breath on the other side of the window. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was animals, a raccoon, maybe a fox, but I loaded the .22 and left it by the door just in case. I didn't sleep great that night. The next morning, I found footprints behind the cabin. Human ones, barefoot. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out without shoes, and these were fresh, pressed into the mud near the water tank runoff. They looked small, almost child-sized, but wide. Like the person who made them had a strange gait or was missing toes. There were only a few steps, leading from the tree line toward the back wall, then away again. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not fear exactly, just that cold recognition that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I followed the direction the prints came from but lost them after about 20 feet. The ground was harder there. I didn't want to go too far from the cabin, so I went back and cleaned up the area, brushed the prints away with a branch. I didn't want to keep looking at them. That afternoon, I stayed inside. I didn't light the fire. I didn't open the windows. I sat with the rifle across my lap and tried to read, but I kept glancing at the door. The silence was different now, heavy. I started noticing little things, like how the woods went completely still around 4 p.m. No bird calls, no wind, no distant rustling, just a blanket of silence. It stayed that way until almost dark. Then the sounds came back all at once, like someone flipped a switch. I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't feel right. That night, I heard movement again, closer this time, a scraping sound under the porch. Then footsteps, slow, careful ones, on the gravel path that led around the side. I sat in the dark, holding my breath, rifle ready. I didn't move to the window. I didn't want whoever it was to see any shift of light or shadow. The footsteps stopped. A long pause, then nothing. No sound of retreat, just gone. I didn't sleep at all. I waited until morning, then stepped outside with the rifle and checked everything again. No prints this time, but the doorknob on the shed was smeared with something. Mud, I thought at first, but when I looked closer, it had streaks of red. It wasn't blood. Smelled sour like old meat or spoiled milk. I didn't touch it. I left it and went back inside. I decided then I was done. I couldn't prove someone was messing with me, but my instincts told me I needed to go. I packed everything by noon, locked up the cabin, and drove back toward town. I didn't call the owner. I didn't leave a note. I just left. Back home, I had trouble sleeping for a few weeks. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps outside. I kept checking my doors, but nothing happened. Slowly, things went back to normal. 3 months later, I was at a used bookstore and found a local guidebook about the Ridge Hollow area. It had a section on land disputes from the early 2000s. There was a lawsuit about property lines and a brief note about an old trailer community that had been cleared out for environmental reasons. One line stood out, asterisk, the last known occupant was a man named Miles Jerkin, who reportedly refused to leave. The location of his camp was never confirmed, but sightings of a barefoot man in the woods continued for several years. Asterisk, I shut the book and left without buying anything. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. There are places that look empty, but they're not. Sometimes something's still there. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person who's been there too long. Someone who learned how to move without being seen. Someone who lives in the silence and watches anyone who steps into it. I was lucky. I left before he didn't want me to. The summer I turned 27, I decided to take a break from my usual hectic schedule in the city. My name is Aaron, and I work in digital marketing. It was a quiet field, but the pressure and long hours were wearing on me. I had gotten so used to the constant buzz of emails, calls, and projects that I was starting to feel like I was on the edge of a breakdown. So, when I saw an ad for a remote cabin rental near the small town of Cherryville, I thought it would be a good chance to disconnect for a while and clear my head. The cabin was in a place called Pine Ridge, nestled deep in the woods, about a 5-hour drive from the city. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. The first few hours on the road were smooth. The trees along the highway grew thicker the further I went, and the air got crisper. I had my music on, my windows cracked to let in the cool breeze. The sun was setting when I finally turned off the main road and onto a gravel path. The road narrowed, winding between the towering pines, and the further I went, the less I saw of civilization. There were no streetlights, no signs of other houses, just the occasional glimpse of a deer or a rabbit darting through the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even better than the pictures. It was a small, wooden structure with a wraparound porch and big windows that overlooked a steep hill and a small, clear creek. The place was isolated, sitting at the edge of a dense forest. There was no one else around for miles, not a single neighbor in sight. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. I unpacked my things quickly, glad to be away from the noise of the city. The cabin had a rustic charm, with wooden beams across the ceiling and a large stone fireplace in the living room. I set up my stuff, grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, and sat on the porch to watch the sun dip behind the mountains. The air smelled of pine and earth, and everything seemed so peaceful. That first night, I fell asleep easily. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire in the living room, the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant call of an owl. I woke up early the next morning, stretched, and stepped outside to get a better look at the surrounding woods. The place felt oddly quiet, almost unnaturally so. I couldn't hear any birds, no insects buzzing, not even the wind in the trees. It was like everything was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just because it was so early. I had come here to relax, after all, not to dwell on things like that. I made breakfast, brewed some coffee, and decided to take a walk down by the creek that ran behind the cabin. The air had a crispness to it that felt refreshing, and the sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming. The forest around me was thick with trees, the ground soft and damp. I followed the creek for a while, admiring the quiet beauty of it all. But the further I walked, the more I began to feel like something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that there was anything specific, nothing overtly strange, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd stop, listening intently, but there was nothing. Not a sound, not a movement. I turned back after a while, deciding I had seen enough for the day. The walk had made me feel a little uneasy, though, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, but the unease lingered. The rest of the day was peaceful enough. I spent a few hours reading on the porch, then took a short nap in the cabin. By the time evening rolled around, I had forgotten about the weird feeling from the morning. The sun set slowly, casting an orange glow across the cabin and the surrounding forest. I had planned on grilling some steaks on the small barbecue outside, but just as I went to light it, I noticed something odd. There was a dark shape standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. It was difficult to make out, almost like a shadow blending with the trees, but it was unmistakable. Figure standing still, watching me. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move for what felt like forever. My first instinct was to shout, but my throat tightened, and I stayed silent. I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things, so I squinted, trying to get a better look. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the figure seemed to melt back into the trees. Just like that, it was gone. I thought about it for a while, standing there in the fading light, the chill of the evening creeping in. The logical part of me said it was probably just some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I didn't think bears were common in this area. But there was a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, still and silent, just watching me. I decided to stay inside the rest of the night, keeping the lights on and the doors locked. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made my heart race. I didn't sleep well that night. Every noise made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, moving around the cabin. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to go into Cherryville for supplies. I needed to get out of the cabin, clear my head. The drive down the winding road was quiet, and I couldn't help but feel relieved to see a few other people in town. It was small, with only a few shops and a cafe, but it was busy enough to feel like a normal place. I grabbed a few things, including some more food, and talked to a local woman in the shop. She mentioned that the cabin I was staying in had been empty for a while, but didn't say much more than that. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I returned to the cabin, the sense of unease was back, stronger than ever. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. That night, as I sat on the porch, I heard something, a noise in the woods. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it became more distinct. It was a crunching sound, like someone stepping on branches. I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked toward the forest. There, just beyond the tree line, I could make out movement. A figure. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran inside, locked the door, and sat in the dark, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I packed up and left. I didn't care about the money I had paid for the cabin, didn't care about anything but getting the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The place looked the same, but it felt different, like something was watching me still, even as I left. I never went back to Pine Ridge. The unease never really left me, and even now, all these years later, I still wonder what it was I saw in those woods. Was it just my mind playing tricks, or was someone or something really out there? I don't know, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and I'll never forget the silence of that cabin, the kind of silence that weighs on you, heavy and suffocating. If you ever find yourself near Pine Ridge, I'd advise you to keep driving, because some places, no matter how beautiful they seem, are better left undisturbed. The cabin stood in a secluded part of the woods, deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was a spot I had stumbled upon through an old travel brochure, one that promised peace and quiet away from the hustle of everyday life. At 27, I needed that space to breathe, to clear my mind. Life had been overwhelming lately, and a solo trip seemed like the perfect way to escape. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the forest. I had arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the tall pines. The air was cool, and the scent of pine needles mixed with the earthy aroma of wet soil. The cabin was older than I had imagined, but sturdy, with thick logs and a stone chimney. The windows were slightly fogged from the inside, and the wooden porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, looking around. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, isolated. It felt like the kind of place where you could lose yourself in nature without anyone around to remind you of the outside world. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. It was clean enough, though. A single wooden table sat in the middle of the room, with a couple of chairs pushed against it. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, ready for a fire, but it was summer, so I wouldn't need it. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove, an old fridge that hummed quietly, and a sink with running water. The only other furniture was a worn couch and a thick quilt-covered bed in the far corner of the room. It didn't take long for me to unpack my things. I had brought some food, a few books, and enough supplies to last the few days I planned on staying. I had no particular plans, no agenda. I would hike, fish, read, and just let the time pass slowly. That's all I wanted. Peace. The first few hours were exactly as I had imagined. I spent some time sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip lower and the shadows grow long across the forest floor. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. Chirping birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional distant call of an animal. It felt like everything was just as it should be. No interruptions, no noise except nature. As dusk fell, I lit a small lantern in the cabin and started to prepare dinner. The small stove clicked and hissed as the flame caught, and I cooked some pasta, just a simple meal. I wasn't planning on making anything fancy, just enough to fill my stomach. The warmth from the stove was a welcome comfort, and the sound of the boiling water was a calm rhythm. I ate alone, staring out the window, watching the forest darken and become even more still. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The forest outside was quiet now, save for the occasional sound of a twig snapping in the distance. I had read for a while, then decided to turn in early, the fatigue from the day's travel weighing on me. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, with thick blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. I settled in, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sunlight filtered through the gaps in the wooden blinds, casting a soft, golden glow over the cabin. I stretched, feeling refreshed, and decided to go for a hike. The air was crisp as I stepped outside, and I breathed in deeply, enjoying the scent of pine and fresh earth. There was a small trail nearby, a faint path that seemed to wind through the trees. I grabbed my water bottle and set off, following the trail deeper into the woods. The forest was dense here, the trees towering above, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The path was narrow but clear, and it led me through thick underbrush and patches of wildflowers. I hiked for hours just following the trail as it wound through the trees. I came across a small creek, its water rushing over rocks, creating a peaceful sound that made me pause for a moment. I sat on a rock near the edge, took a sip from my bottle, and watched the water flow. It was easy to lose track of time in a place like this, and I realized I had been hiking for longer than I intended. I had no particular destination in mind, no agenda. The forest was enough. But as I made my way back, I began to notice something strange. The forest, which had felt so alive when I first arrived, now felt different. It was as though the sounds had faded, and the trees seemed to close in on me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the place felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the air felt heavier, and the silence seemed deeper than it had before. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip low again. The woods had taken on an even more somber tone, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway ominously. I hurried inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it. The feeling of unease didn't go away, but I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, I told myself. I had been hiking alone in unfamiliar woods, and it was natural to feel a bit on edge. I decided to stay in for the rest of the evening. I cooked a simple dinner, just some rice and beans, and ate while sitting at the table. The silence in the cabin was deafening now, almost oppressive. The creaking of the old wood as the house settled was the only sound that broke the quiet. After dinner, I sat in front of the fireplace, staring at the dying embers, lost in thought. The strange feeling hadn't gone away. It lingered, just out of reach, like something was waiting in the shadows. I went to bed early again, determined to get a good night's rest. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept tossing and turning, the unease from the day following me into my dreams. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of movement just outside the cabin, shadows darting between the trees. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to whisper, but it was all just a figment of my imagination, I told myself. But then, in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It was so sudden, so sharp, that it sent my heart racing. I lay still in the dark, listening intently, but there was no sound, no wind, no movement, just the heavy silence of the cabin. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and made my way to the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it had just been the house settling. But then I remembered the sound. It had come from outside, a solid, unmistakable bang. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area with the flashlight. The beam of light swept over the trees, but everything looked calm, peaceful, almost too quiet. I stood there for a moment, the cold air nipping at my skin. The darkness felt thicker now, the trees more imposing. The feeling of unease returned with full force, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just outside the cabin. I kept hearing the occasional sound, a branch cracking, a rustle in the underbrush, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just shadows. The following day was different. The sun was bright, and the air had a lightness to it, but the feeling from the night before still lingered. I had planned to spend the day exploring the nearby lake, a small, crystal-clear body of water I had heard about from the brochure. But as I packed my things, I felt a nagging hesitation. Maybe it was just the thought of being out in the woods alone again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the end, I decided to stay near the cabin. I spent the day sitting on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind and trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was out of place. As the sun set, the unease in my chest grew, and I locked the door for the night, just as I had the night before. But this time, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening, waiting, hoping it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. Just after midnight, I heard the noise again. A knock, a thud, like something heavy hitting the cabin wall. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. What I saw next made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the night sky. My breath caught in my throat, and I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I locked it. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight on, my eyes darting between the windows, convinced I was being watched. The next morning, I left. I couldn't explain what had happened or why I felt so uneasy, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. As I packed my things and walked down the porch steps, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But as I drove away, I felt a weight lift off. It had been a long drive to get there, about 6 hours, give or take, from the small town where I lived to the cabin deep in the woods. I had rented the place for a week, needing a break from the city, hoping the solitude would help me sort out the mess that had been building up in my life. I didn't really have any expectations except for peace and quiet, maybe a chance to reflect, but as soon as I pulled up, I could feel the air change. The cabin itself was older than I had imagined. The wood was weathered, and the roof had patches where the shingles were missing. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in a long time, but that was fine with me. The more secluded it felt, the better. I grabbed my bags from the trunk of my car and made my way up the small dirt path to the porch. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear exactly, just the feeling of walking into something old, something that had its own history. I stepped inside, setting my bags down on the floor by the door, and took in my surroundings. The interior was basic: a small kitchen with a stove, a refrigerator, and a sink. A worn-out couch sat against one wall, facing a fireplace. A wooden table in the center of the room, with mismatched chairs around it. The floors creaked under my boots as I moved through the space, and the smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. It was everything I expected, and I could already feel the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I dropped my things and made my way to the back of the cabin, where the bedrooms were. The bedroom I chose was small, just enough space for a bed and a dresser. The bed had a thick, quilted blanket on it, and the window overlooked the trees outside. It felt like the perfect place to relax and disconnect from everything. I didn't waste much time unpacking. I was too eager to get settled and enjoy the peace. The first day passed quietly. I spent some time exploring the woods around the cabin, taking in the fresh air and listening to the sounds of nature. I found a small stream nearby, its water gurgling softly over rocks. I sat by it for a while, enjoying the solitude. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and the wild. The kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over everything. I made a simple dinner, ate it while sitting by the fire, and went to bed early, ready to start fresh in the morning. But that's when things started to feel off. It wasn't immediate, but I began to notice small things. The way the trees outside seemed to rustle even when there was no wind. The occasional creaking sound from the walls of the cabin, as if the house itself was breathing. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the house settling, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. At night, I would lie awake in bed, staring out the window into the pitch-black forest. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. On the third day, I decided to go for a hike. There was a trail marked on the map I had found in the cabin, one that led to a small clearing where supposedly there was a good view of the surrounding area. I figured it would be a good way to clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and a few snacks and set out early in the morning. The hike wasn't long, but it was harder than I expected. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, with thick branches and underbrush brushing against my legs. I kept my eyes on the trail, not wanting to trip, and after about an hour of walking, I reached the clearing. It was just as the map described. A small open space with a view of the valley below, the mountains rising in the distance. I took a deep breath, enjoying the peace of the place, but something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't the view or the quietness, but something in the air, an almost oppressive stillness. No birds, no wind, just the faintest rustling of leaves. It was then that I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, barely visible in the dirt, but unmistakable. Someone had walked through the clearing recently. I knelt down, studying them. They were large, too large to be mine, and the soles of the shoes were heavy, like boots that had been worn for years. Whoever had made them had walked in a straight line, as though they had a purpose. I stood up quickly, my heart rate picking up. I looked around, but the forest was still. No one in sight. I had been on the trail for over an hour, and I hadn't seen another soul. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a sudden urge to get back to the cabin. The hike back felt longer. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my pulse racing. By the time I returned, the sky was beginning to darken, and I made sure to lock every door and window before settling in for the night. I was still uneasy, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But the feeling of being watched was ever present. Every time I glanced out the window, the trees seemed to shift, as if they were hiding something. And I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the tree line. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on in the cabin and sat near the window, staring out into the forest. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by the unsettling silence. And then, around midnight, I heard something. A knock. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it came again, louder this time. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move. The knock came a third time and then silence. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the door, peeking through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, but I knew something was off. I felt it deep in my gut. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching and listening. The sounds outside were distant, like someone was walking around the cabin, but whenever I looked out the window, no one was there. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I had no choice but to leave. I packed my things quickly, not caring about being organized. I was ready to get out. I grabbed my bags, made sure the cabin was locked, and stepped out into the daylight. The sun was bright, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. I didn't stop to take in the view or enjoy the peace. I drove straight back home, my hands gripping the wheel tight, never looking back. It wasn't until I was back in town, safe and sound, that I realized just how much my mind had been playing tricks on me. I was home, away from the cabin, and the unsettling feeling was gone. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that I had narrowly avoided something that might have been watching me the whole time. And I realized then that the cabin wasn't just old. It was waiting. The drive back had cleared my head, but there was still that nagging feeling, the one that wouldn't go away. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that cabin again. I couldn't shake the thought that the woods were meant to stay undisturbed, and I had disturbed them. I was 31 that year, and I had been feeling burned out from everything: work, the city, even the people around me. I lived in a noisy part of Cleveland, and every day felt like it was closing in on me. I needed quiet, distance, and no obligations. So in early October of 2022, I rented a remote cabin in the Adirondacks, just north of Indian Lake, New York. It was a 2-week rental, just me and a backpack full of supplies. I wasn't planning on seeing anyone. I didn't want to. The place was about 5 miles off the nearest paved road, only accessible by a rough gravel track that cut through dense woods and curved around a small ridge. I had to park my car a mile away from the cabin and hike the last bit in. It was isolated, no phone signal, no internet, no power except a small solar panel hooked up to a few lights and a battery for charging small things. It was perfect. The cabin was simple but not falling apart. Wooden walls, metal roof, a little deck facing the trees. Inside was one room with a wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, shelves stocked with basic cookware and a few old books, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed water tank. It was the kind of place where time slows down because there's nothing to mark it except the sun coming up and going down. The first few days were calm. I would wake up early, make coffee on the propane stove, then take walks through the woods. I didn't follow trails. I preferred wandering, stepping carefully between ferns and fallen branches, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I'd sit by the edge of a creek about half a mile from the cabin and just watch the water. I brought a notebook with me, but I didn't write much, just a few thoughts here and there. The silence did more for me than any words could. By the 4th day, I had settled into a rhythm. I chopped wood in the morning to keep the stove going, read in the afternoons, and took short hikes when the weather allowed. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. That was the plan, and I liked it that way. But around the 5th night, something small happened that I brushed off at first. I had just finished dinner, boiled rice and canned beans, and stepped outside to stretch. The air was cool and still, and I stood on the deck for a while, breathing it in. The forest was quiet, the way it always is after dark. But then I heard a sound, not loud, just a soft crunch of leaves, coming from the slope behind the cabin. I froze and waited, trying to hear more. It stopped. I figured it was a deer or maybe a fox. It was their home more than mine. The next morning, I went out back to check. I didn't see anything unusual. No prints, no broken branches. So I chalked it up to animals. The days were shorter now, and the nights got colder, so I spent more time inside reading or sitting by the fire. Still, every now and then, I'd hear something at night. A footstep that wasn't mine. A branch snapping too close to the cabin. Not often, but enough to make me start locking the door at night even though I knew no one should be around. On the 7th day, I went for a longer hike. I packed water, a sandwich, and headed southeast through the woods, aiming to circle back in a wide loop. I had marked the cabin's location in my GPS watch just in case, but I didn't plan on getting far. After maybe an hour and a half, I came across something that didn't feel right. It was a small clearing, the kind that looked like it had been cleared a long time ago and then partly reclaimed by the woods. In the center of it was an old metal barrel, rusted, half buried in the ground. Next to it was what looked like the remains of a tarp or plastic sheet, now shredded and stuck under fallen branches. And on one of the trees at the edge of the clearing, I saw a red rope tied around the trunk. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't completely weathered either. It had no obvious purpose. I didn't touch it. The whole place felt wrong. I backed away and went back the way I came. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises outside, subtle ones. A shuffle of leaves, a faint knock. Once I thought I saw a shadow move past the edge of the window, but I couldn't be sure. I had no neighbors, no other cabins nearby. I reminded myself that I'd probably just spooked myself with the weird clearing and let my imagination run wild. But I started keeping my axe next to the cot, just in case. On day 9, I woke up to find the door unlocked. That scared me more than anything else. I always locked it at night. Always. My hands shook as I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. But the lock itself hadn't been damaged, it was just turned open. That told me someone had been inside. Someone with hands and the sense to turn a knob, not a wild animal. I didn't know if they were still around. I didn't know if they had been watching me for days. I considered leaving, packing up, and hiking back to my car. But I was stubborn and tried to convince myself it could have been a mistake. Maybe I thought I locked it but didn't. Maybe. I couldn't prove it either way. So I stayed, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the lights off and stayed quiet. I sat in a chair by the window for hours, listening. I didn't hear anything that night. That almost made it worse. On day 10, I went out again to check the area. I looked for signs, footprints, any broken twigs, anything unnatural. And I found it. Near the path I normally used to go to the creek, I saw a rope hanging from a branch about 10 feet off the ground. It had a loop tied at the end, nothing large enough for a person, but it didn't belong there. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That was the moment I made the decision to leave early. I packed most of my things that afternoon. I planned to head out the next morning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed. I kept scanning the woods, hoping to see nothing but half expecting something, or someone, to be there. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't cook anything. I stayed in the dark, waiting for morning. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard the cabin's floor creak. Just once. The kind of sound that happens when someone shifts their weight slowly. I didn't move. I just stayed still, my axe gripped in my hand under the blanket. I didn't hear anything else after that. Just the wind. When the sun finally came up, I didn't waste time. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and left. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't bother sweeping or closing the place properly. I just locked the door and started walking fast down the path toward my car. The hike back felt longer than it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the tree lean, listening for anything behind me, but nothing came. I reached my car in less than an hour. When I got there, I checked the tires, the trunk, the back seat, everything. It was all untouched. I got in and started the engine. The relief didn't come right away. I kept looking in the rearview mirror as I drove down the gravel road, expecting someone to appear behind me, but the woods stayed quiet. It wasn't until I hit the main road and saw other cars again that I started to feel normal. By the time I made it back to Cleveland, it felt like the whole thing had happened in a dream, except I still had the axe in the passenger seat and the bag packed with the things I didn't use on my last night. I never reported anything. There wasn't anything clear to report. No crime, just a feeling. A sense that someone had been there, watching, waiting, and maybe they didn't like that I was in their space. Or maybe they didn't care at all until they realized I was alone. I don't know, but I haven't been back to the woods since. I still hike sometimes, but never that far out, never that isolated. And I don't stay overnight anymore. That cabin reminded me that people are scarier than anything you can make up in your head. And that sometimes, someone might be out there who doesn't need a reason. Just an opportunity. I was 32 when I decided I needed a break from people. It was late October 2018. I was living in a crowded apartment complex in Tucson, Arizona, and the noise and constant pressure of work and city life were starting to grind me down. I just finished a rough project that had stretched on for nearly 6 months. And after turning it in, I told my boss I needed a week off. I didn't want to go to a beach or a hotel or anything like that. I wanted total silence, somewhere far from cell service or traffic or voices. I started looking online for cabins to rent and came across this place just outside a small town called Ouray, Colorado. The cabin was isolated, backed into a thick patch of forest, and sat at the end of a gravel road about 30 minutes from town. It looked worn down in the pictures, not fancy, but sturdy and comfortable enough. The listing said there was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and no cell reception. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my car with some food, water, a few changes of clothes, and a couple of books. I left Tucson around 4 in the morning and drove straight through. I got into Ouray around sunset the same day. It was already cold there, colder than I expected. The air was dry and crisp, and snow was dusted across the edges of the road. I filled up on gas, bought a couple of extra things from the local market, and followed the directions the owner had emailed me. The drive to the cabin was quiet. The gravel road was narrow and wound through hills and dense patches of trees. The further I went, the more alone I felt. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and everything turned dark quickly. I had to put my headlights on low and take the last mile or so slowly because the road was uneven, and I kept seeing deer standing in the shadows near the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat alone in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a small porch and a single light by the front door. I parked near the porch, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. No sound, not even wind. Felt peaceful but also strange. I told myself I was just not used to that level of quiet. I brought my bags inside and checked the place out. It had one bedroom, a bathroom, a little kitchen, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. Everything smelled like old wood and dust. There was a pile of firewood next to the stove, and I got a fire going right away because it was colder than I expected. I turned on a couple of lamps powered by solar batteries the owner had set up. The light was dim but enough to see by. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of soup, read for a little while, and then went to bed. The bed was stiff and creaked whenever I moved, but I was tired and fell asleep quickly. I woke up a few times during the night from the cold. Even with the fire, the temperature in the cabin dropped fast. I got up around 3 in the morning to add more logs to the stove and then went back to sleep. The next morning, I felt rested. I made coffee using a little gas stove in the kitchen, stepped outside, and looked around. The clearing was maybe an acre in size, with a narrow path leading off into the trees behind the cabin. I assumed it was a hiking trail. There were no tire tracks besides my own. No signs of animals or people, just quiet. I spent most of that day reading and walking around the property. The trail behind the cabin went about a quarter mile into the woods and ended at a small stream. I sat there for a while, just listening to the water. It felt good to not think about anything. That night, I made some pasta and read by the stove again. Around 10, I started hearing noises from outside. Not loud, just something faint. It sounded like twigs breaking or footsteps on leaves. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a fox. Still, it made me feel a little uneasy. I didn't have any cell service, and there was no landline, so if something went wrong, I'd have to drive all the way back to town. I didn't go outside to check. I stayed in, kept the fire going, and eventually went to sleep. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were a little smaller than my boots, and I had only walked around the front and out back toward the stream. These were on the side, near a small, dusty window. At first, I thought they could be old. Maybe from the owner or someone who came to maintain the place. But I'd walked around that same area the day I arrived, and I hadn't seen any then. I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near the cabin during the night. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close, chopped some more firewood, cleaned the kitchen, and tried to keep myself distracted. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself looking around the treeline, trying to see if someone was out there watching. I saw nothing. No movement, no animals, no people. That night, the noises came back. Louder this time, more deliberate. It didn't sound like random branches breaking. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I sat still by the fire, holding my breath, straining to hear. At one point, the footsteps stopped completely. I stood up, stepped over to the window next to the front door, and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and trees. Then I heard a sound I can only describe as a slow drag across the side of the cabin, like someone running their hand or a stick across the wood. I backed away from the window, grabbed the fire poker, and stood near the stove in silence. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't hear anything else after that. Eventually, I got into bed with my clothes on and the fire poker on the floor next to me. I left one of the lamps on, The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found more footprints, clear ones, definitely fresh. They went from the trees to the side of the cabin, then around the back, and then back into the woods. I followed them for a while, maybe 50 feet into the trees, but they just vanished into the underbrush. I went back inside and locked the door. I knew someone had been there, walking around while I was inside. I debated leaving right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost and wandered near the cabin. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it, but still, something about it felt wrong. Like they knew I was inside and were trying to mess with me. That day, I kept all the blinds shut. I stacked a couple of chairs in front of the door just to feel a little safer. I stayed inside and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something at the back window, a soft tapping, repeated, steady. I turned off the lamp, grabbed the fire poker again, and stood quietly near the wall. The tapping stopped. Then I heard something scrape against the window glass. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to be heard. I didn't move. I stood like that for at least an hour. Then came footsteps again, slow, measured, moving from the back window to the side of the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until the sky started turning gray. As soon as there was enough light to see, I opened the door and stepped outside. There were new footprints again. I followed them further this time, deeper into the woods behind the cabin. After about 200 feet, I found something that stopped me cold. A dead rabbit. It was lying on a flat rock, placed deliberately. Its neck had been broken, and its stomach was cut open. Flies were already gathering. There were no bite marks like you'd expect from a predator. It looked like someone had killed it and placed it there. I turned around and walked quickly back to the cabin. That was the final straw. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved my clothes into my bag, doused the fire, and threw everything into the car. I locked the cabin even though it didn't seem like it would matter. As I pulled out of the clearing and got back onto the gravel road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out of the trees and follow me. I didn't stop until I was back in Ouray. I pulled into the gas station and sat there for a long time, just breathing. Once I was calm enough, I went inside and told the clerk that I thought someone had been sneaking around the cabin I rented. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "Some folks don't like outsiders around here." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. I got back to Tucson late that night. When I emailed the cabin owner the next day to let him know what happened, I never got a reply. I waited a week, then another. Nothing. I never found out who was out there, what they wanted, or why they were stalking that cabin. But I know they were watching me. They knew where the windows were, how to move quietly, and how to leave just enough of a sign to make me afraid. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person. A real person doing real things with some dark purpose behind them. That's what scared me the most. I never went back to Colorado after that, and I haven't stayed alone in the woods since. I rented a small cabin in the northern part of Vermont in October 2019. I was 36 at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer, and I had just finished a big project that kept me at my desk for nearly 2 straight months. My back hurt from sitting too long, my eyes burned from screen time, and my sleep was a mess. I needed to get away from everything, my apartment, emails, traffic, neighbors, the city. I just wanted quiet. I found the cabin through a small rental site someone mentioned in a forum. It wasn't on Airbnb or any major platform. The photos were plain, nothing edited. Just 4 wooden walls, a tin roof, a little stove in the corner, and a bed. The guy who owned it said it had running water and basic electricity from a solar rig. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. That was exactly what I wanted. It sat a few miles from a gravel road near a town called Averill, way up near the Canadian border. I had to drive about 6 hours to get there from where I lived in southern New Hampshire. The last 2 hours were just trees, hills, dirt roads, and occasional signs warning of moose. I passed maybe 2 other cars the whole time after I left the highway. I got there just before sunset on a Thursday. The air smelled cold and sharp, like dry leaves and firewood. The sky was that washed-out blue color it gets in October when the sun's low and the clouds are barely moving. I parked the car about 50 feet from the cabin on a patch of flattened grass that was clearly used for this exact purpose. My boots crunched over dry leaves as I walked to the door. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. The inside smelled like pine and a little like old smoke, like someone had used the wood stove the night before. There was one bed, a narrow one, pushed against the wall. A little shelf with some canned goods and matches. A small table and one wooden chair. I brought all my own food, but I left the cans alone in case I needed them. There were 2 windows, one next to the bed and one above the table. Both were single-paned with old wood frames. The glass had bubbles in it and looked like it had been hand-poured. I could see out, but it made everything slightly warped. There wasn't much to unpack, just clothes, a flashlight, some dry food, a small cooler, and a few books. I put them all away and sat outside on a log for a while, listening to the wind. There wasn't a sound except the creaking of branches and the occasional knock of something falling. Maybe an acorn or a pine cone. It was beautiful and more silent than I'd expected. The kind of silence that's thick. You start hearing your own breath, your own heartbeat. After a while, I went back inside, made a simple meal, and sat by the stove until it got dark. That first night was peaceful. The wind picked up and I could hear it brushing over the roof and pushing at the walls. The cabin creaked, but not in a creepy way, just the sound of old wood flexing with the temperature drop. I fell asleep around 10 and woke up once in the middle of the night to complete darkness. I remember looking out the window and not seeing anything. No moon, no stars, just black. I wasn't afraid, just a little uneasy. I guess being that far out alone messes with your brain a bit. The next day I hiked. There were trails nearby, though most weren't marked. Just old paths deer or hunters had used. I followed one that led down a hill and crossed a small stream. The water was freezing, but clear enough to see every rock on the bottom. I sat there for over an hour just watching it. I didn't bring my phone, didn't check the time, didn't even bring a watch. I just wanted to stop thinking. That evening, I chopped some firewood from the pile behind the cabin. There was a stump with an axe buried in it, like something out of a movie. Everything was damp from an earlier rain, so I had to work a bit to get dry wood. But I managed. I had a fire going by dusk and read a book until the light faded. Again, no weird noises, no issues. But that changed the third night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't part of the wind or the trees. It was a slow crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I didn't move at first. I just listened. I knew it could have been an animal. Probably was. Maybe a deer. But the steps were paced out like a person walking. Slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. Completely. Like whoever or whatever was making them realize they were being heard. I sat up in bed and listened harder. I wanted to check, to look out the window, but part of me didn't want to move. I couldn't see much from where I was. Just the ceiling and the glow of dying embers in the stove. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I stayed still. After a few minutes, I heard the steps again. Only this time they were moving away. Not fast, just a slow, steady retreat. I waited at least 20 minutes before I got up and looked out the window. I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I told myself it was an animal, probably a bear or maybe a moose. Those things make all kinds of noise and don't care who hears them. Still, I couldn't sleep much after that. Every little creak made me perk up and listen. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were marks in the leaves, but nothing clear enough to say what made them. No paw prints, no boot prints, just areas where the leaves had been pressed down or disturbed. I walked the tree line a bit and circled the cabin twice, but didn't find anything else. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read, collected more firewood, and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It's weird how just one sound at the wrong time can change everything. What started as a relaxing trip was now something else. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake it. That night, I set a small trap using a tin cup and some string across the path leading to the cabin. It wouldn't stop anything, but it might make noise if something came close. I also left one of the windows open just slightly so I could hear better. I didn't want to block out the sounds completely. That turned out to be a mistake. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud metallic clink. The cup had been knocked over. I sat straight up and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. Again, the sound of footsteps, this time slower, almost like they were trying not to be heard. They circled the cabin once, twice. Then I heard something scrape lightly against the wall, like a stick or a knife dragged along the wood. I stayed in bed, not moving, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I didn't want to shine the light through the window because I didn't know if that would make things worse. Whoever was out there, if it was a person, they were messing with me. They weren't trying to break in. They were testing me. The footsteps went quiet again. I waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. Just silence. When the sun rose, I found the tin cup about 10 feet away in the dirt. The string had been snapped, not untied. There were clear shoe prints now, boot prints. Not animal. Human. They were large, probably a man's. They led from the tree line to the cabin, then around it twice, just like I'd heard. Then they disappeared back into the woods. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I'd been run off. Maybe I thought I could handle it. I told myself it might be a hunter or a local screwing around. But I knew deep down this wasn't some bored kid. This was someone who knew I was alone and was taking their time. That day I didn't hike. I barely ate. I just sat and listened. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind. I was on edge. When it started to get dark, I locked the door and jammed the chair under the knob. Even though I knew it wouldn't stop much, I kept the fire low and didn't light the lantern. I didn't want to draw attention. That night I didn't sleep. Not even a little. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they came right up to the window next to the table. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, just soft, steady. It lasted about a minute. Then more slow steps around the cabin. And then the handle on the door clicked. Not turned hard, just touched, tested. I had the axe beside the bed by then. I held it tight and stayed frozen. Eventually the sounds faded. Whoever it was, they left again. When the sun came up, I left. I didn't pack much, just grabbed my bag and threw it in the car. I didn't look around. I didn't take one last look at the cabin. I just drove. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, but nothing came of it. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't want to follow up. I just wanted to forget. The strange thing is, nothing actually happened to me. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was stolen. The cabin wasn't broken into, but it was clear someone out there knew I was alone, and they were enjoying the game. I think that's what unsettled me the most. Not the noise, not the footsteps, but the patience. Whoever they were, they weren't in a rush. They were watching, waiting, testing me. I never went back to that cabin. I don't go anywhere that remote anymore. Not alone. I still love nature, still go on hikes, but always where I can see people, where my phone works. That trip changed something in me. I still think about those nights. I was 32 when I rented the cabin in northern Idaho. It was late September 2017. I had just finished a long, drawn-out work contract that had completely drained me. I'd been sitting behind a desk, staring at 2 monitors for 12 hours a day for nearly 5 months. The project was finished, the team celebrated, and for once I had nothing waiting for me when I got back home. No work, no meetings, no obligations. I needed a break. Something far away from noise, people, and constant emails. I found the cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't one of the big platforms, just a niche site for outdoorsy rentals. The listing described it as an off-grid log cabin, secluded and peaceful, deep in the Clearwater National Forest. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't care much for luxury or convenience. I wasn't going there to stream shows or eat fancy food. I just wanted to sleep, hike, maybe fish and reset my brain. I booked it for 10 days. It was about a 4-hour drive from Coeur d'Alene, mostly winding through dense woods and climbing into some seriously remote territory. The last 30 miles were gravel, then dirt. I lost cell reception halfway through the dirt road. That didn't bother me. I had planned for it, downloaded maps, packed everything I needed, brought backups of everything. Food, water, batteries, even firewood and gas canisters. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One room, a covered porch, a fire pit out front. It was built with thick logs that had darkened from years of sun and weather. There was a creek running behind it, maybe 30 feet away, and beyond that the tree line went on and on like an endless green wall. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, not even aircraft overhead. It was quiet in a way I'd almost forgotten existed. Inside, it had a basic wood stove, a single bed, a small table, and shelves with basic kitchen tools. A few hooks for hanging things. No running water, just a 5-gallon jug and some buckets. An outhouse about 30 yards away, around a bend behind a few trees. There was a hand crank radio and some flashlights in a box, a couple of lanterns, and a few old magazines on the table. The first 3 days were everything I needed. I hiked during the day, cooked simple meals on the wood stove, read one of the paperbacks I brought, and slept like a rock. I woke up with the sun and went to sleep not long after it set. My brain felt like it was slowly turning back on after months of being on autopilot. The sound of the creek, the wind moving through the pines, it was like medicine. On the 4th night, I woke up just past midnight. Something felt wrong. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but my body was tense. It was like a switch had flipped inside me. I sat up in bed and waited, listening. The fire in the stove had gone down, and the inside of the cabin was cold. I wrapped a blanket around me and went over to the woodpile, feeding a few small logs into the stove. I stood there watching the flames catch, trying to shake the strange feeling in my gut. Then I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, more like a shuffle, a slow movement through dry leaves. I froze. I didn't move a muscle, just stared at the door. The sound came again, this time a little clearer. Something walking on 2 feet. Not a deer, not a bear. Someone. My mouth went dry. I moved slowly to the window. There was no glass, just a shutter I could pull aside. I did it slowly, peeking out. The moon was out, and I could see parts of the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing. I looked toward the trees near the fire pit. Nothing moved. I waited a full 5 minutes, scanning every shadow. Then I heard it again, closer now. It came from the side of the cabin, the direction of the outhouse. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and turned it on, aiming it through the window in that direction. Again, nothing. Just the trees, the slope down to the creek, and the edge of the cabin in shadow. I kept the light there for a long time. Nothing moved. Eventually, I shut the shutter, turned off the light, and sat on the bed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I stepped outside and did a slow walk around the cabin. I checked near the fire pit, behind the outhouse, and even walked a little down toward the creek. I saw nothing. No tracks. No signs anyone had been there. Could have been an animal, I told myself. The forest played tricks on your ears at night. Echoes. Branches falling. Maybe I imagined the footsteps. But I didn't believe that. That day, I went on a long hike, trying to clear my head. I climbed one of the nearby ridges and spent a few hours just sitting and looking at the valley. I brought my camp chair, some snacks, and a thermos of coffee. I didn't see or hear anything unusual all day. When I came back to the cabin, the light was slanted and orange. I rebuilt the fire in the stove, made a simple dinner, and sat on the porch watching the sky get dark. I didn't sleep well that night either. I didn't hear anything, but my nerves were on edge. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made my heart beat faster. I stayed in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling for hours. The next day, I found something that made my skin crawl. I was walking behind the cabin near the creek, looking for dry branches to use as kindling, when I saw a shape on the other side of the water. It was a boot, just one. A heavy black boot, sitting at the base of a tree. I hadn't noticed it before. I crossed the creek, climbed up the short slope, and picked it up. It was old and worn but still intact. Inside was a torn sock and a few dead leaves. Nearby, I found a rusted can of beans with holes in it, and a bit farther up, a blue tarp folded beneath a pile of branches. It looked like someone had been camping there at some point, maybe squatting, but I didn't see any other gear. No tent, no bag, no sign of a campfire. It was just the tarp, the boot, and the can. I looked around for any more clues, but the area was clean. It didn't feel recent. The leaves and pine needles covering the tarp looked like they'd been there for a while. Still, it added to the unease. I didn't know if someone had passed through recently or if this was from years ago. Either way, it meant someone had been out here before. Someone had camped less than 100 yards from the cabin without it being in the listing or guest book. That night, I locked the cabin door and slid one of the chairs under the handle. I kept the flashlight on the table next to me, fully charged. The axe was leaned against the bed. I didn't sleep at all. My ears were wide open, every sound making me sit up and hold my breath. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the noise again. This time it was more deliberate. Steps, slow and clear. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it at the door, waiting. The sound stopped. I held my breath. Then it came again, this time from the back of the cabin. I moved to the window facing that direction and cracked the shutter open. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees. Not moving, just standing. Their shape was almost hidden in the dark, but the outline was clear enough. They didn't have a light. They weren't walking. They were just there. I froze. I didn't know if they could see me, but I didn't move the light. I didn't shine it at them. I watched for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, my body completely stiff. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, the flashlight in one hand, the axe in the other, until dawn. When morning came, I packed everything. I loaded the food, the bedding, all my gear back into the truck. I didn't care that I had 4 more days left on the rental. I didn't care that the contract said no refunds. I just wanted to leave. Before I drove off, I walked to the back of the cabin again, where I had seen the figure standing. There were faint tracks in the soft dirt. Footprints, not boots like mine. Worn shoes. The prints led from the woods to the cabin, then back again, disappearing into the trees. I followed them for a while, maybe 200 feet in, but the ground got hard and covered with leaves and I lost the trail. I got in the truck and drove back the way I came. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back in the mirror. When I got back into cell range, I called the rental site and reported what I'd seen. They said they'd look into it, but I didn't hear back. I looked up the area later, trying to find news or police reports. I didn't find anything useful. No missing persons, no crimes linked to that cabin. I thought about going back, just to see if anything else turned up, but I knew I wouldn't. I still think about that night sometimes. About the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. They didn't try to get in. They didn't say anything. They just watched. That was enough. Since then, I've gone on other trips. I've hiked in different places, even camped again. But I've never gone that far off-grid again. Never stayed somewhere I couldn't leave quickly. That trip reminded me of something I forgot. Just how vulnerable you really are when you're alone in the woods. No walls, no neighbors, no signal. Just silence and the unknown. And sometimes, that silence watches you back. I had been needing a break from the city for a while. I'd been working 12-hour shifts for months without a real break, and even my weekends were filled with errands, noise, and crowds. It was February 2022, and even though the temperatures were still low, I figured it was a good time to take a few days to myself somewhere quiet. I booked a small cabin in the northern part of Michigan, near a lake called White Hill Lake. It was about a 5-hour drive from where I lived in Toledo, and the pictures on the listing made it look like the perfect kind of getaway I needed. Isolated, small, clean, and surrounded by trees. I left early on a Thursday morning to beat the traffic. I packed simple things, some canned food, instant coffee, a small cooler with milk and eggs, extra batteries, a flashlight, my phone charger, a map, a multi-tool, and a thick coat. I didn't think I'd need anything fancy. The cabin had no internet and barely any cell signal, which was part of the appeal for me. I wanted to be away from everything and everyone for a few days. The drive was smooth. It was cloudy the whole way, and the roads got narrower as I got closer. After the last gas station, I drove for nearly 40 minutes without seeing another car. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road that led to the cabin. There were tire tracks in the snow, probably from whoever managed the property, and I followed them until I saw the small wooden cabin tucked between tall pines. It looked a little more weathered than the pictures, but nothing too concerning. There was a stack of firewood by the front steps and a locked box with a key on the side, just like the owner said. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt that stillness you only get in places far from people. The inside of the cabin was simple. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, a small counter with a hot plate, and a bathroom in the back with a working toilet and a small shower stall. No TV, no radio, not even a clock on the wall. Just quiet. I started a fire in the stove with the wood and matches left by the door, unpacked my things, and made a sandwich. I sat at the table and stared out the window for a while. Snow was falling lightly, just a few flakes at a time, and it made the trees look softer. That first night was peaceful. I read a book for a while, ate some instant noodles, and turned in early. The wind picked up after sunset, and I could hear it moving through the trees and brushing against the walls of the cabin. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to silence. No wind, no creaking, nothing. And then I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. I held my breath and waited. They stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it could have been a deer or something similar, and after a while, I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some fresh air and checked the firewood. The air was sharp and cold, and I noticed a few tracks in the snow near the side of the cabin. They weren't boot prints, more like irregular shapes, like someone walked with socks or soft shoes. They went from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin and then disappeared. I stood there staring at them, trying to figure out if they were fresh. They didn't seem too deep, and there was a light layer of new snow over them, so I assumed they were from the day before or even earlier. I tried not to think too much about it and spent the day reading, cooking a small meal, and walking a little along a trail behind the cabin. I didn't go far. There were no signs of people anywhere, just rabbit tracks and broken branches. The wind had picked up again by late afternoon, and I stayed inside with the fire going, keeping myself warm and trying not to let the silence get to me. That night, things felt different. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded, or maybe it was just my nerves. Around midnight, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a scraping noise, like wood dragging across wood. It lasted about 5 seconds, then stopped. I got up and walked to the front door, opened it a crack, and looked outside. Nothing. Snow, trees, dark sky. I turned on the flashlight and looked around the edge of the porch. Still nothing. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed, but it took me over an hour to fall asleep. My mind kept turning over the possibilities. A branch falling? Some animal? But animals don't drag things. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The firewood pile looked different. Not smaller, not bigger, just rearranged. The logs that were stacked evenly the day before now had a small gap in the middle, and some of the wood was at a different angle. It looked like someone had reached in and pulled out a few pieces, but then changed their mind and put them back. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. I told myself I might have done it yesterday and not remembered. I had no proof of anything, so I tried to brush it off. Later that day, while I was boiling some water, I noticed that my multi-tool was gone. I had left it on the counter next to my book, and now it was gone. I checked all around the table, under the bed, in my bag, and in the bathroom. I even checked outside. It was just gone. I sat down and tried to calm myself. I hadn't left the door unlocked. I hadn't seen anyone. But now the tracks, the noises, the firewood, and the missing multi-tool started to connect in a way I didn't like. I kept the flashlight with me for the rest of the day, even while indoors. Around dusk, I heard movement outside again. Not loud, just a faint crunching in the snow, a little ways off. I turned off all the lights and stood near the window, looking out from the corner. The trees were still. The wind had died down again. I didn't see anything, but I knew something or someone was nearby. I waited for almost half an hour, staring, listening, but I never saw a figure. The sounds stopped eventually. I lit the fire again, locked the door, and stayed up most of the night. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard the back door handle rattle. It didn't turn, but it moved, like someone was testing it slowly. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, barely breathing. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Then, 5 minutes later, the sound of snow being stepped on. Slow, careful steps going around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and stayed in the dark, holding the flashlight tightly, ready to shine it if I had to. Eventually, it went quiet again. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided I was leaving. I didn't care how much I had paid for the booking. I packed everything quickly, shoved my clothes and food into the bag, and stepped outside to load the car. That's when I saw the handprint. On the back window of my car, just above the trunk, was a handprint. Bare hand, no glove, pressed into the glass. The fingers were long and thin, and the print looked fresh. I touched it, still slightly damp. Whoever had been outside during the night had walked right up to the car and touched it. I felt a wave of nausea. I got in the car and started the engine, but the tires spun. I had parked too far into a soft spot near the side of the cabin, and the snow had built up under the wheels. I tried rocking the car back and forth, moving slowly, but it was stuck. I got out, dug some snow away with a flat piece of firewood, and tried again. Still no luck. I went back inside the cabin to calm down and think. I didn't want to walk 5 miles through the woods in freezing weather to find help, but I also didn't want to stay another night. I thought maybe I could find something around the cabin to help with traction. There was a small old rug in the bathroom. I grabbed it, cut it into strips with a kitchen knife, and wedged the strips under the tires. After 2 more tries, the car finally lurched forward and crawled out of the hole. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I drove straight out of there and didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost an hour later. I pulled over, went inside, bought coffee, and sat at a table for half an hour just to feel like I was around people again. I never got an explanation for what happened. I didn't call the police because I didn't have proof of anything. No faces, no damage, no real evidence. Just small things that kept adding up and a feeling in my gut that someone had been watching me out there. The listing for the cabin disappeared 2 weeks later. I don't know if the owner took it down or if something else happened. I never heard of anything in the news. To this day, I still don't know what kind of person sneaks around a remote cabin in the middle of the woods in winter just to mess with someone and disappear into the trees again. Maybe it was a squatter, maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe just someone who enjoyed the fear they could cause without ever being seen. But I do know this. I'll never stay in a cabin that far from help again. I don't care how peaceful it looks in the pictures. I still remember the week I spent up in the mountains near Roan Creek, Colorado. It was late September of 2017. I had just turned 34, and I needed a break from everything. My job, the constant noise in the city, the people, the pressure. I'd been working at a car repair shop for almost 10 years, and I hadn't taken a real vacation in a long time. I didn't want beaches or tourist spots. I just wanted quiet. So I looked for remote cabins online and found this small, old one about 20 miles from the closest paved road. It was owned by some old couple who rented it out occasionally. They said it was stocked with firewood, basic furniture, and a generator for electricity, but there was no running water or cell service. That was fine by me. I brought my own water in big jugs, food, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, and a basic toolkit just in case. I also brought my .22 rifle, not for protection, really, just in case I wanted to go hiking and spotted something I could legally hunt. The drive up was rough, especially the last couple miles. The dirt road was narrow and twisted, surrounded by thick pine and aspen trees. The trees started getting taller and denser the higher I went. I had to take it slow to avoid damaging the undercarriage of my SUV. Eventually, I found the turnoff and spotted the cabin about 100 feet off the main trail, partially hidden by trees. It was smaller than I expected, Just one room with a metal roof, a little chimney poking out, and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were dusty but intact. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something slightly musty but not unbearable. There was a small bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, some shelves with cooking gear, and a big steel cabinet that held the generator. The fuel for the generator was locked up in a box outside the cabin. I unlocked it with the key the owners gave me and started the generator. It gave off a steady hum that was comforting in a weird way. I shut it off after a couple minutes, just to test it. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked around the area, made simple meals, read an old paperback I brought, and kept a small fire going in the stove at night. The weather was cool but not cold. A little fog rolled in at night, but it burned off quickly each morning. There were no other people for miles, and the silence was better than I imagined. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something outside. Not an animal, something heavier. It was faint, like footsteps in the dirt, just 1 or 2. I froze and held my breath, listening. Nothing followed. No other sounds. I chalked it up to maybe a deer or elk wandering close, rolled over, and tried to sleep again. Still, I kept the rifle next to the bed after that. The next day, I did a sweep around the cabin, looking for any signs of animals. I found some prints that looked like deer a little ways off the trail, but nothing too close to the cabin. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. But that night, the sound came back, this time closer. It was clearer now. I heard the crunch of leaves and sticks under slow steps, one after the other. Then they stopped. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the dark with the rifle in my hands, staring at the window. I could see the outline of trees in the moonlight, but not much else. There was no movement, no wind, just complete stillness. I stayed like that for over an hour, listening. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. The next morning, I looked again. Nothing was out of place. No tracks, no marks on the ground. But I felt something had changed. The forest didn't feel the same. It felt tighter, like the trees were pressing in a little more than before. I couldn't explain it. Later that day, I walked down the road a bit, maybe a mile or 2, just to clear my head. On the way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Halfway buried in the dirt near a bend in the trail, there was a crushed beer can, old and rusted. I brushed away some of the dirt and found a torn piece of blue fabric, like from a jacket or shirt. It was stuck under a root. I didn't think much of it at the time. People came through the woods now and then. Hunters, probably. But that night, something happened that I still can't explain. I was lying in bed, the fire low but still burning in the stove. The air was quiet again, too quiet. I heard it, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Not walking this time. It was a soft scrape, like fingers or something being dragged along the wooden wall. Then it stopped. Then it came again on the opposite wall. Slow, steady, deliberate. I stood up slowly, loaded the rifle, and turned on the flashlight. I didn't go outside. I just aimed it through the window and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. No movement. I waited again, heart pounding, and then I turned the light off and sat down. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I went outside and walked around the cabin. On the far side, low to the ground, I saw faint scratches on the wood. They looked too straight and too narrow to be from animals. More like someone dragging something sharp, but not deep. Just enough to mark the wood. I touched them and felt my stomach turn. I wanted to leave that day, but something stopped me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I made the scratches myself without realizing. Maybe they were old and I just noticed them now. That afternoon, I decided to go farther out, toward a ridge I saw on the map the owners gave me. It was supposed to give a good view of the area. I packed a snack, some water, and the rifle just in case. The hike took a couple hours. The ridge did have a great view. I could see for miles, trees, rocks, even the dirt road I had driven up on. I stayed up there for a bit, just breathing in the cold air. On the way back, I took a different path down, thinking I'd loop back to the cabin from the other side. That's when I saw something that really scared me. About 200 yards off the trail, I spotted a small clearing with what looked like an old, half-collapsed tent. It was faded green, sun-bleached, with one side completely caved in. I walked closer, staying quiet. There were old clothes scattered nearby, a boot, an empty bottle, and a rusted camp stove. Everything looked like it had been sitting there for years. But then I saw something that didn't belong. Fresh footprints in the dirt leading to and from the tent. They weren't mine. The shape was different. Larger boots, deeper impressions. Whoever made them had been here recently. I turned around and made my way back to the cabin fast, trying to stay calm. The air felt colder as I walked. My brain kept trying to make sense of things, but nothing added up. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give off any light. I turned off the generator. I sat in total darkness, listening. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. They came from the back of the cabin, moved slowly toward the front, then stopped by the porch. I could hear the boards creak under the weight. Then nothing. I sat there in the dark, gripping the rifle, not breathing. I didn't move until the sun came up. That morning, I found footprints on the porch, big, muddy, and deep. Whoever it was had been standing right at the door. I packed everything and loaded the SUV in under 20 minutes. I didn't even bother sweeping or cleaning up. I just left. On the way down the road, maybe 5 miles out, I saw something in the distance. A man walking along the road, away from the cabin. He was wearing a dark jacket and faded jeans. His pace was slow, steady. He didn't look at me as I passed. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. When I got back to the nearest town, I told the sheriff what I had seen. The old tent, the footprints, the scratching sounds, the man. He nodded and said people sometimes came out into the woods to disappear, that there had been reports of missing campers in the past, but nothing ever came of them. He didn't seem surprised, just tired. I drove home the next day. I haven't gone camping since. I still think about the man I saw, about the tent, about the scratches. I think someone had been living out there, watching, maybe waiting. Maybe he didn't like that I was in what he thought was his space. Maybe he'd scared off others before. Maybe not everyone made it out. But I did. I made it out. I don't care if I was paranoid. I trust my gut now. That trip changed the way I look at the woods. Not everything out there is wild. Some of it is worse. Some of it is human.